Hi guys, I hope you can hear me. And here we go on our second week of online cost control. So this week I'm going to talk about, what am I talking about? Oh, cost of labor. So we'll talk about labor cost and trying to control that so you can operate your restaurant profitably. First thing that's kind of important to keep in mind is right now we live in a world where labor is expensive, really compared to what it has been historically. Labor is expensive and food is cheap, which is different than historically the way it's been. So right now it's very important to maintain our labor cost. In many establishments, if not most, the cost of labor actually exceeds the cost of food and beverage. So part of what makes labor high is it's more than just the wages that are paid. So it's, if you're making $10 an hour, there's more to it than that. It's probably costing the establishment close to twice that to employ you if you're a full-time employee because they're paying things like your FICA, unemployment, workers' comp, life insurance, health insurance. If you have a pension, they're providing meals, training you costs something. Maybe there's a uniform included in there, plus you get vacation time or you get sick leave, and all these other incentives and bonuses are also included in the cost of labor because this is the cost that it takes to employ someone. Now, just some terms about what we'll be talking about. One, we're going to talk about payroll, and payroll is all the pay received by an employee for their work. Now, some of you may have been a salaried employee before, and what's meant by being salaried is that you get the same income over a accounting period, whether it's a week or a month, regardless of the number of hours you work. And I'll tell you, when the first time you get a salaried job, don't calculate your per hour wage. I know that when I became a chef and was in the guy running the place, I made less per hour than the dishwasher because of the total number of hours that I worked. So payroll is just one part of labor expense. Some other important ideas for you to keep in mind is minimum staff. So minimum staff is the minimum amount of people you need to operate a facility. So imagine that you have sort of a regular full service restaurant. What's the minimum number of people you need to have in there to call yourself open to be ready to serve a customer, even if you have if you have no reservations? What's the minimum number of people you need to have in there? So if you have like a full service restaurant, well, you probably have to have a hostess because if someone comes in, they're going to need to be sat. And you probably have to have at least one bartender. And you probably have to have at least one server. And you probably have a manager on duty. And you probably have, at least one or two people working the line in the kitchen just in case someone comes in. And, you probably have a dishwasher. So right there, you're looking at like 7 people minimum that you have to have in order to operate the facility. That's the idea of minimum staff. And as you start getting people coming in to eat, you have to add more, you add more staff. But the very minimum you have to consider yourself open, that's the minimum staff. Now, fixed payroll, that's the amount that you pay in salaries. So, probably your manager, your assistant managers, they're all salaried. So even if, no matter what your total number of people come in and eat in the week or the month, those salaries, that amount of money, that amount of payroll stays the same. So it's fixed. Now, the variable payroll, though, that's the amount that's paid to hourly employees. Because when you're busier, you pay more. When you have a full, if it's the summer, you have more employees working. You're paying more in labor. You're doing that because you have more guests coming in to eat. If it's a Tuesday night in December, you have a very minimal amount of employees working that night because you have a minimum number of guests. So your payroll varies depending on how busy you are. And so that amount that you pay your hourly employees, that's variable payroll. Just as an aside, your minimum staff and your variable payroll are not the same thing. Your minimum staff is a minimum amount you need to stay open. Your variable is just that amount that you pay your hourly employees. Now, management really has no control or very little control over fixed labor. There's nothing I can do to lower my fixed labor once I've agreed to pay someone as a given salary. It is what it is. But we have total control or near total control over the variable labor. I can schedule when someone works. I can schedule how many hours they work if they're an hourly employee. And I can put them on when I need them and as much as I need them. So our labor expense is all these costs kind of combined together that we have to use to maintain a workforce. And just keep in mind that total labor is always going to exceed payroll because labor, there are other costs besides what I pay you if you're my employee. There's also what I've spent on training you and all those other expenses that I mentioned earlier. Payroll is considered controllable, but things like FICA and insurance, I don't have any control over. There's not much I can do to lower my insurance premiums, for instance. So that's really outside of my control. It's an expense that I can't control. There's a little bit of control over it. Like I said, there's not much I can do to lower my insurance premiums for most things, but there are a few things, like if I have a liquor license and I require my employees to be certified in responsible alcohol service, actually I can probably get a break on my insurance premiums if I do something like that. So as a manager, one of the things you're really concerned with when we're trying to be a manager is this concept of productivity. And productivity, it can be used to measure all sorts of things, but what we're really looking at is how much work can an employee get done in a period of time. And you can use it for all sorts of employees, all sorts of positions, and what you get is essentially what's called a productivity ratio. And here it says output over input, but what that means is, so imagine you have a dishwasher. So what is the output for a dishwasher? Well, that's the number of dishes that they can wash. And forgive me, I have a new toy here I'm playing with. So we have dishes, and the input is a number of hours. So boy, this looks terrible. There's too much lag. So the productivity ratio looks like the number of dishes per hour that someone can wash. Whereas on the other hand, if I'm talking about a bartender, maybe it's the number of beers that can be served in a shift. So then it becomes beer divided by shifts. And so that'll give me the productivity. How many beers in a shift can the bartender serve? So that's one way to think of the productivity ratios is it gives you an idea of how much an employee is able to accomplish in a given time period. So things that affect productivity, and all these are important. So employee selection, having the right employee. Ritz-Carlton spends a huge amount of money on employee selection. And they feel that by selecting the proper employees, the right people doing the right jobs, that they're able to have a more productive workforce. They select people who are highly motivated and people who are motivated by service. The amount of training and the quality of training will affect your productivity. If I give someone a really good training program so they understand what they're going to encounter and how to deal with it, that's much better if someone's just thrown into a situation, has to figure it out. Supervision, the amount of oversight by a manager who has a bigger picture understanding of the operation will make an employee more efficient. Scheduling. I can schedule people's work so that it can be more efficient. And we'll talk about this a little bit like when we get into split shifts. Breaks. If someone works continuously without a break, they become more likely to make a mistake. Their productivity goes down. They're more likely to have errors. They're more likely to be slower. So giving employees enough break time to recharge and to get back to maximum capacity. Morale, how much you enjoy your job, how important you think it is, how motivated you are, all those things will play into your productivity. If you think your job is important and that you do a good job and you're well recognized for it, you will work harder and do more. The menu, the amount of labor and complications that are involved in the menu will determine productivity. You can probably serve more people at a Waffle House. A single cook can probably prepare more meals in a Waffle House than they could in a fine dining restaurant, just because it's more complicated. That kind of ties into the next one, the convenience versus from scratch. If I have an item that is prepared and ready to go versus making it from scratch, it tends to go faster. I can get more accomplished with fewer employees. We'll talk about equipment and tools, and we'll talk about service level when we get there. So let's jump into these topics. So employee selection. Like I said, Ritz-Carlton spends a lot of time making sure they have the best employees so that they have a productive workforce. Some of the things we do to help pick the workforce are in the hiring process. So two of the things that we commonly come across are job descriptions and job specifications. So a job description is it's a listing of all the things that an employee does if they have that job, whereas a job specification is a description of the person who would be good for that job. So here's a job description, and it's listing all the things that person has to do. If they're a room service delivery person, they have to answer the phone, they have to set up trays, they have to remove tray covers. These are all the things that person does. Versus the job specification here, it describes the type of person that would be a good fit for this job. It would, someone who is detail-oriented, has a pleasant personality, discreet. So that's the difference between the job description and specification. Other things that, as far as employee selection, that can lead to a more productive workforce is through the application process. So the first thing is the job application in and of itself is the first step. You look at the job application is used to weed people out. Oh, they can't follow instructions. They didn't fill the form out properly. They don't have the right qualifications right off the bat. You can use it to weed people out. You want to make sure that you conduct interviews and that you do your interviews properly. There are certain questions you can't ask. I can't ask someone how old they are. I can't ask if they have children. I can't ask if they're married. I can't ask if they're planning to have kids, because all of those things are potentially prejudicial against them. And then you're leaving yourself open to being sued. Another thing we do to help with productivity is pre-employment testing. And there are lots of different types of testing that we can do before we hire an employee. So a really basic one is skills testing. And this is very common for chefs. Come in, show me what you can do. Prepare a meal, do a mystery basket, those sorts of things. Very common. I want to see that you have the skills that are necessary for this position. Psychological testing. How many people, have you ever had to take a Myers-Briggs personality test, where it'll look at 4 components of your personality and say, like you're an INTJ or some other combination of these 4 sets of personality traits. There's not a lot of good science behind them, but they're commonly used as indicators for if someone would be a good fit for a certain type of job. I'm not a big believer in them myself, but they're still commonly used. And then pre-employment drug testing to make sure that people are not using illegal drugs, which is very common in the restaurant industry. Oddly enough, when I was a chef's apprentice a billion years ago, we were drug tested for nicotine because nicotine dulls your sense of taste. So the chef his opinion was, I'm not going to bother you teaching to cook if you're going to smoke or use smokeless tobacco, because it's dulling your sense of taste anyway, and you won't get it. So pre-employment drug testing used to weed people out. You want to do background checks on your employees for hiring them, uh, because you are subject to litigation under what's called negligent hiring. So imagine that you hire a room service attendant. So their job is to take food up into guest rooms. Well, what if that person has been convicted of assault or some sort of other job? Is this a person you want sitting into guest rooms, unattended? No, you're putting the guest at risk. So you have an obligation to do background checks on these on your employees to make sure that you're exhibiting reasonable care in your selection of employees. Another thing that makes employees more productive is the level of training they get. Um, and training is everything, all the way back to your orientation. Orientation is the first part of training, because the things that will make employees less productive are like worrying about when payday is, or how do I log in to work at the beginning of the day? How do I clock in? A good orientation program should remove those worries and cares from an employee so they can just concentrate on the work, on the task at hand. And the other thing is task training, teaching people how to do the job, to do it productively, quickly, efficiently, in the way you want it done. Rather than just saying, well, here, go mop the floor. No, show them how you want it done. Show them where the equipment is. Show them how to refill the chemicals in the mop closet. Show them where the backup mop heads are so that they won't have to waste time looking for them. Spend the time training in the beginning, and you increase their productivity in the end. So the steps in a training program, I'm just going to hit these really quick. First, plan out, develop your training program. What do you want to do? Plan out what the session is going to involve. So I have an hour with this new employee. What skills do I want them to get in that hour? Then I am going to present the training. I'm going to show them what to do, or work with them and have them demonstrate what to do. Then I'm going to go back and evaluate and see if it was effective. Can the employee do what I trained them to do now? Now, if they can, then the training was effective. If they can't, well, I need to look at reworking my training to make it more effective. And then periodically you have to retrain. You have to reinforce what people already know. Let's see, what makes workforce productive? Well, supervision. Having employees that have access to their manager when they need it. More or less, the manager needs to be out and visible and working. The manager who sits in his office and plays solitaire on his computer, not an effective manager. The best manager is a manager who manages by walking around. They're out there dealing with customer problems, asking their employees if they need anything, offering to help or guide the employees when they need help. I mean, a good manager really doesn't look like he's doing much because he's constantly walking around and just checking on his employees. Let's see, scheduling can also make your workforce more productive. So scheduling your employees so that you get the most use out of them, the most work out of them. So one example I use is what's called a split shift. So here we've got the schedule, and if you look at it, we've got this is a restaurant that is open all day long. So we have a couple options here about how to schedule people. So when is the restaurant busy? Let's say it's a lunch and dinner restaurant. Well, they're probably busy from about 11 o'clock till about 7 o'clock. So you've got a lunch rush from 11 to 1, and then you've got a dinner rush, from 5 till 7:30 or 8. And so when they're really at peak capacity is that kind of 11:30 to 7:30 period. So rather than having employees work, 2 employees work morning shift and 2 employees work evening shift, have one employee that splits the shift. So you have one employee that's there for both meal periods when it's at its peak, but they're not there at the slow times before or after. Now, There are lots of I realize there are lots of factors that go into this type of decision. And if I were you, the one thing that would come to mind is like, well, when are they going to get their prep done? So all I'm saying is that this is a tool. This is a way that you can look at schedules, and you're not bound. Don't let yourself get caught up in thinking that you can only do things one way. Be flexible in how you schedule people so that you can get more accomplished. Um, I mentioned break. Just keep in mind breaks are necessary. People are more efficient. They get more done when they have some downtime to recharge. Talked about morale. Basically, uh, let your employees know that what they're doing is important and necessary, and you appreciate it. Create a vision. Tell them like where they fit in, what's necessary. I'll tell you that the most important person in a kitchen is probably the dishwasher, because you cannot operate without them. I can run a hotline missing one employee. I can run garmage with having a manager running back and forth. I cannot run a restaurant if I don't have a dishwasher. So like letting that person know how important they are. Feed them first. Let them know you appreciate them. Those sorts of things that increase morale and make them more efficient. Okay, the idea of employee turnover. Employee turnover, how many people basically work in your restaurant? So if I have a restaurant that has 50 employees, let's say. So if I have 50 employees, boy, it lags just far enough behind that I can't see it when I'm doing it. So I have 50 employees. But at the end of the year, I go back and I count, and I see that I've actually had 100 people work for me during the course of the year. Um, I had a lot of servers who worked for a couple months and left. I've had to replace them. I've had a lot of people in the back of the house. So I've gone through 100 employees. So that's where I get that 200% turnover, which means in an establishment that has 50 employees, I have hired 100 people in a year. So that's a 200% turnover. And that's normal for our industry. It is normal in our industry to replace every position in your restaurant twice a year. It's crazy. So some of the terms you may have seen on that side, separated. Separated basically means when someone's no longer employed. So you can be voluntarily separated, which is when the employee quits, or you can be involuntarily separated, which is when the employee is fired. And you can do turnover ratios for each of those, the involuntary and voluntary. And they tell you things like if you have a lot of people quitting, maybe you have a problem manager, or maybe the workload is not realistic. If you have a lot of people being fired, maybe your HR isn't doing a job, or you're not doing a good job selecting employees. But the thing to keep in mind is turnover is expensive. The industry average is about $3,500 per employee every time you hire a new employee. So that's training, that's loss of productivity, all those things. About $3,500 for every employee that you have to hire. So this quickly adds up in cost. Menu will determine how productive someone could be. A simple menu, employees will probably be more productive. A complicated menu, they'll probably have a lower level of productivity. You have to think about that when you're designing a menu and how many employees is it going to take. It depends on the level of complexity of your menu. Same for convenience versus scratch. If I'm cutting my own French fries, I need to have someone whose job it is to cut French fries. If I'm buying frozen French fries, well, all I gotta do is just pull those out of the freezer and fry them. And so I have to decide which one more fits with the idea of my facility. So I can actually go through and do the calculation on how much, what the benefit is from scratch versus buying something that's pre-prepared or a convenience product. So here we have the what are these frijoles, refried beans, and I have a choice. I can either make them from scratch or I can buy them. Now, if I buy them pre-made, they're $40. That's pretty expensive versus just buying, uncooked beans at $18. So if you look at it at first, it seems like, well, making them from scratch makes more sense. It's so much cheaper. Well, even if I add in the salt, the seasonings to make the refried beans at $2, still seems like a good deal. But then I start factoring in labor. Let's say I have someone here, it says $8 an hour. That's really not very much, is it? 1 hour of labor to make the prepared beans, probably less. Whereas if it's from scratch, someone's going to have to spend some time attending to it for 4 hours. And then how much am I going to spend on propane or fuel or however I'm heating these up, compared to the different amounts for the from scratch versus convenience. And then I get to the end where, well, if I make it from scratch, when I factor in labor and fuel, it's $56. Whereas if I buy the product, it's $49. Well, which one should I do? If I'm looking at it from a cost point of view, just cost, I should buy a convenience product. It doesn't make sense to make my own refried beans. Equipment and service levels both play into productivity. So think about it. I can make French fries in a tilt skillet. I can make French fries in a pot on top of a stove. But if I have to make a lot of French fries, it's probably best if I have a fryer. I can make more French fries with less waste faster with a fryer. So the level of the type of equipment I have will affect my productivity. So how do we measure productivity? There are lots of ways to look at this, and this is just trying to get a grip on how well you use your labor versus what it costs you. So the first one, the one that is probably the standard that we talk about most time, is just labor cost percentage. So with the labor cost percentage, we look at the total cost of labor. So however much I spent on my employees. Where's my? So let's say I spent $1,000. And then, and I generated $3,000 worth of sales. So there I get a labor cost of 33.3 ... just kind of goes on forever, percent food cost or labor cost. So that's my cost of labor. Is I spent $1,000 on labor. So let's say however $10 an hour, I paid for $100 of labor, and it generated $3,000 in sales. That means my labor cost is 33.3%. And so this gives me a pretty good understanding of how well I'm using my employees, what they're getting done. And I can look at just management labor costs. I can look at hourly labor costs. There are all sorts of ways I can break this out. So here we go. We've got some these charts kind of illustrating what I was talking about. So we have the cost of labor up here, and we have how much sales it generated. So if I divide this 29 right here by this 83, I get the 35% food cost, and that is my labor cost. Now I can use this to decide, well, what would it be like if I gave a raise? So here I have my $29,000 in labor cost, and here I've multiplied it times 0.05 to get a 5% raise. I add those two together and get this $30,796.50. Now my sales, stays the same because that's how much, what I'm looking at is what would the effect be if I gave a 5% raise. And what would happen is it would raise my food cost to $36.08. So my food cost, if I give a 5% raise, will go from 35% to 36.8%. So then I have to decide, well, is that worth it to me? And if I give a raise, it becomes a calculation, well, will my employees become more efficient? Maybe they will. That's a calculus. That's a decision you have to make as a manager. So that's one, the labor cost percentage is one tool we use, but there are others. So sometimes we'll use sales per labor hour because what we're really concerned with is labor. Because if I don't make the most of an hour of labor, if I'm paying an employee who doesn't do anything, well, I've still got to pay him, but I can't get any additional work out of him. So what I want to look at here is total sales divided by hours used. So it could be, I have generated $1,000 in sales. And from 25 hours of labor. So let's say, I was paying servers and I had 25 hours that I was paying them for. It generated $1,000 in sales. What does that tell me? Well, what that tells me is that I can generate $40 because this is 1,000 divided by 25. I generate $40 for each hour of labor. It's like, okay, and so that's another tool that allows me to kind of understand how efficient my employees are being and how well I'm using them. So we have the chart again, looking here. So I have my cost of labor up here, 29,000, the 29,300 for a month of labor. What happens if, and I generate $83,000 in sales? Well, what happens if I increase my sales by 5%? So this is 83,000 plus this $4,190 in selling price increase gives me my new total sales. So what happens to my labor cost when I increase my sales? Well, I get 33.3% labor cost. But now let's look at it in terms of sales per labor hour. I have $83,000 in sales. How many hours did it take for me to generate that many sales? Well, it took 3,722 hours of labor. And so that means for every hour of labor that I pay for, I generate about $22.51 in sales. So again, that gives me some understanding as a manager about, well, if I schedule this many people this much time, I'm probably it's going to equate to about this much revenue. So that's a pretty good indicator, but that doesn't consider how much I pay my employees. Some employees get paid more. So I can take that out of the equation by taking the cost of labor and divide it by the guests served, and that'll give me the labor dollars per guest served. So the cost of labor, let's say I spend $1,000 on labor and serve 20 guests. Well, that means that for every guest I serve, I have to spend about $40. Okay, so again, that helps me understand how I manage and how I need to manage. And then one last way I can look at it in terms of guests served per labor dollar. So just different ways of using these calculations to see what you're doing as a manager, how efficient your employees are being. One more that is a useful tool. Sometimes we work in an environment where we don't have, where revenue may not be that important, or in a situation where I'm trying to compare wildly different types of operations. So if I have a restaurant in South Georgia and I have a restaurant in Manhattan, the amount I pay my employees and the cost of the food is wildly different. So how do I compare the efficiency of those operations? Well, I can look at the number of guests served versus the labor hours. So instead of looking at dollars, I look at it in terms of guests. So how many guests did I serve versus with how many hours scheduled of employee labor. One last way that we'll talk about this is I can look at it in terms of revenue per available seat hour. How much money do I make off of each seat in my restaurant per hour that it's available? That's what it is. So if you think about a restaurant, how much money do I have divided by, I have 20 seats that are available for 8 hours. And, so that is, I have 16 available seat hours. So how much money do I make off of each available seat hour? How much do I make? Calculate, when I want to look at it that way. So here are all the formulas, different ways of looking at it that you can use. Let's see. I'm not going to get heavily into the 6-column form here. You look at those. Look over those. Let's see. We can also establish labor subcategories. So there are different types of labor. So it could be, the kitchen, the front of the house versus back of the house versus sanitation versus management. I can look at how efficiently I'm using each one of those by looking at the number of guests served divided by how much I'm spending on each one of those categories. Okay, let's see. I'll let you read through these things because, yeah, I'll stop there. You can read through the slide, the rest of the chapter. And if you have any questions, I'll be available Friday. And I hope everybody has a good week.